Thank you very much. Let me get this going. Okay. Yeah. After a pandemic and several years teaching on Zoom, but still we don't get it right. Okay. First of all, thanks again for the invite to this interesting colloquium. Thanks, Thomas, for the very interesting presentation. So what I'm going to be presenting is also related to another feature of the second demographic transition, which is the increase in family instability and divorce. But we're going to be shifting from Europe to China. And what I'm going to present, rather than an overview, broader overview, I'm going to present a research paper that I've been working on together with Zhiqiang Liu, who did his PhD at the Renmin University in Beijing, and is now at the Zhejiang Academy of Social Sciences. He was here at the EUI as a visiting researcher when we started this work. So what I'm going to be presenting on, I'm going to be presenting a study on divorce trends in China, where we look at increases in divorce from the point of view of adults and then the point of view of children. And in addition to just children, we also look at separately from the son and the daughter perspectives. And let me first just introduce what the big framework is, that there's an increase in divorce in China. There's been an increase in divorce in South Korea, in many other countries in East Asia. And we know that the increase in divorce is one crucial part of the second demographic transition, together with postponements of marriage, fertility, what we heard about before. And to put this in context, in 1990, especially, divorce was still very rare, and it's in China, and still the divorce rates are lower than compared to some of our other countries in Europe, but it's been increasing rapidly, and it's actually approaching many European countries as well. So that there's been a clear increase in divorce in China as well as elsewhere around the world. Now, one of the concerns of the increases in divorce is that this question of whether how does divorce or family dissolution more broadly, how does it affect children? And there's kind of been but commonly the increases in divorce, which is the increase in divorce rate, of course, is calculated from the adults couples point of view, or adults marriages, which the point of view. But this has been equated with an increasing experience for children to experience their parents' divorce and separation. And this has been one of the kind of leading concerns that has been in the literature on that. But what happens to the children? But if there's such a big increase in divorce rates, such a big increase in divorce rates, and more children are experiencing divorce. Now, there was a recent paper in the American Sociological Review by Matthias Kalmain and Thomas Leopold. This was part of a project where both me and Christian were also part of, like one of the papers that came out of that. But they demonstrated how the risk of experiencing separation has increased much less among children than among adults. But they looked at all separations, so including separations from cohabitations, and they showed basically that these two trends haven't always gone in parallel. That adults are experiencing separations much more than children have been experiencing it. And I show you some of the findings from their paper. Here they break it down by education, but here we can see that the blue lines or blue-green lines show the increase in separation rates among adults, and the x-axis is birth cohort, and then the lila trends show how the rates of experiencing parental separation has developed among children. So we can see on the upper left-hand corner, for example, that we can see that especially among the highly educated, that there's this kind of there's this discrepancy that there's an increase in adults' annual risk of experiencing separation, which has grown much faster than among children. Among children it has remained more or less stable. We see the same thing among highly educated couples and children of highly educated couples in Sweden, for example, that there's this divergence in the experiences if we look at the adult perspective compared to if we look at the child perspective. You can also see that this is not exactly the same in all countries, and there's also this stratification by education. But nevertheless, the main point that they were making was that just looking at trends in divorce and separation at the adult level, but we cannot directly infer that this has translated into children's increasing experience of experiencing parental divorce. Now, the reasons that they discussed that why this discrepancy happens was that we know that children stabilize unions, or vice versa, that less stable couples have fewer children. But in any case, there's a kind of a clear correlation between whether you have any children in the first place and how many children you have. But there's a negative correlation. So but it's childless couples who are most likely to separate, followed by couples with only one child, etc., and so forth. And they also showed in this specific paper, they also showed that this association in many countries has become stronger, that more and more separations are actually happening among childless couples than among couples with children or with many children. Now, part of this has to do with the rise of cohabitation as a trial, but we can call it a trial partnership or a partnership, but where having children might not be at least immediately in the radar, but there's a lot of an increase in Europe in cohabitations, many of which dissolve maybe after a year or maybe after two before they even kind of enter the serious childbearing stage in their partnership. But we also know that, as I showed in the previous slide, that there's educational stratification in separations, and that there might be, in addition to this diverging trends among from the child and the adult perspective, that there's also can be educational stratification on this, but how these trends play out. But in any case, the crucial explanation for the divergence from the adult and child perspective has to do with the fact that couples with children are less likely to separate than couples without children, and then that this increases more or less monotonically depending on how many children you actually have. Now, what we were interested in was that we found this study, and I think many others have found this study extremely enlightening and very thought-provoking. And the one thought that we had was that should we be actually expecting a similar trend in China? And this could also be thought that could we expect something similar in countries that share key characteristics with China in terms of family demography. And reasons why we started off by thinking that maybe this wouldn't apply to China in the same way as in Europe. And the reasons for that were that there's much less unmarried cohabitation in China. And for example, in our data where we looked at that there were couples who were cohabiting, it was usually for a couple of months before marrying. So it was very, but I know that in very recent years that this has also started to change, especially in the big cities. But nevertheless, that cohabitation is still most often kind of the period just before marriage where the couple lives together. So that we would have, that we would have fewer fewer of these maybe unstable cohabiting couples, and especially fewer years spent in those unstable cohabiting couples. Now, there's also related to this that there's very close temporal spacing between marriage and children. So that typically the first child is born very soon after the wedding among Chinese couples. So that this again would suggest that there's, in terms of just time, but there's less time as a childless couple. There's less time spent as a childless couple, which was one reason we thought that the adult and child perspectives would probably be closer to one another than in Europe. Now, then we also know that there was the former one-child policy and later two-child policy led to smaller families, which was again the reason that why we would think that if there are fewer families in the couple, that again the adult and child perspective would converge. And now, after naming all the differences, but there are also similarities between the Chinese case and the European cases, but we know that there's a growing educational gradient in divorce in China as well, but it's the less educated who are divorcing more than the highly educated in China, as well as in many European countries. Now, an additional feature that when we were planning the study that we started thinking that in the Kalmans and Leopold study, that they only looked at children regardless of the gender, and not separating that whether the trends should be similar among for sons and for daughters. Now, we did this separation. We started thinking about the separation basically from the starting point that we know that in China there's a strong son preference. Hello, Zhiqiang, we just started. But there's strong son preference in China, and that also that having a son strongly stabilizes marriages. But there's a discussion about this, that does having sons stabilize marriages in Europe or Northern America, and some say that it slightly does, others say it doesn't. But in research that we know of from China shows that there's a kind of strong stabilizing effect in that country. Now, on the other hand, there's a kind of this opposite pull, but this would suggest that because of the stabilizing effect of having sons, we would expect that sons will also be less likely to experience separation. Now, there's a kind of an opposite pulling or oppositely affecting factor, which is that sons are also less likely to have siblings, and it's the case that Chinese couples were more likely to continue their fertility than if they didn't have a son. So that this shows, for example, in our data, that 30% of the sons were the only siblings, and 50% of the sons had one sibling, whereas for daughters, the respective figures were 23% and 49%. So that as a consequence, daughters were more likely to be from bigger families. And what I said about if you have more children, that the couples tend to be more stable, so that this would be countervailing factors that we might expect. Now, from this, our research questions are pretty straightforward and follow very closely from for the most part, from the Kalman and Leopold study. But first of all, that we asked that are the trends in the risk of divorce similar for Chinese adults and children, and in case of children, of course, from the point of view of parental divorce. Also asked that are the same for sons and daughters, and then we also asked whether education moderates these trends or not. Now, we looked at this question using data from the Chinese family panel studies from collecting 2010 to 18, which have retrospective information on marriages. We focus on marriages partly because this is what is being collected, but the data doesn't have cohabitations unless they were before a marriage took place. So cohabitations which didn't lead to marriage are not included, but also that as I mentioned, that marriages, cohabitations that don't lead to marriages are still relatively rare. So we're pretty confident that we're not grossly underrepresenting separations. We have 23,000, a bit more than 23,000 adults, 38,000 children, where we look at that the adults become at risk of divorce when they marry, whereas children become at risk of parental divorce at birth. And then we combine this data in the same way as Kalman and Leopold did to one database that includes both the adults and children, and also that they come at risk of separation at different points of the parental union. And we estimate event history models, the right sense at 18 years after the wedding or birth, depending on whether it's adult or child perspective. And we look at trends by cohorts. We actually look at marriage cohorts, what I'm going to be presenting here, and then birth cohorts for children, of course. And in some cases, we have these interactions for education to look at the moderation. And then we have a couple of control variables that are relevant here. Now, to go to the results, one of the main results is that we actually do see, unlike what we were actually expecting a bit, that we do see a similar divergence from in the adult and child perspective. That we do see that from the point of view that adults' risk of experiencing divorce, annual risk here in this case of experiencing divorce, has grown much faster than children's risk of experiencing divorce. Now, one interesting kind of methodological feature here is that you can see in the graph that this gap is growing, but it's only growing in the absolute sense. That when we run the event history models, that we can see that the interaction between child and marriage year is not statistically significant. So this means that the relative gap in the divorce risk between adults and children has actually stayed the same, but because the baseline risk of experiencing separation has grown, but then this stable relative difference translates to a growing absolute difference in the hazards. So the ratio of the hazards has remained the same, but the difference in the hazards has increased because the baseline separation or divorce risk has increased as well. Now, but in any case, but there is this difference in the adult and child perspective, and at least in the absolute sense, it's also increased. Now, when we looked at it in terms of education, but we can see that children to college-educated parents, that their experience of separation has actually stayed very stable, whereas from the low-educated adults' point of view, but there's been a steep and very clear increase in the risk of separation. So that we see this educational stratification interacted with the children as well. But what we do see in difference to Europe is that we see, like, between the adult and child perspectives, we see the biggest difference in among the less educated, whereas in Europe it was the opposite, but the biggest difference was among the highly educated. Now, then finally, we had this question of whether sons are less likely to experience parental divorce than daughters. And in what I show here, the model 4, but this suggests that no, that is actually not the case, unlike what we were expecting. So sons are equally likely, or at least there's no statistically significant relationship between being a son and being a daughter on the risk of experiencing a parental separation. Now, however, once we adjust for the number of children in the household, then we do find actually a difference. So but adjusted for family size, that sons actually are less likely to experience separation, as we would have expected. So that there's this countervailing effects, that having a son decreases the risk of separation for the couples, and that means that sons are less likely to be experiencing separation. But because sons grow up in smaller families, which tend to increase the risk of separation, but these two forces kind of counteract one another, and unless we control for the number of children, that this hides the family stability among sons compared to daughters in China. Now, summarizing what we have found was that we can also in China, but we can also see this increase in divorce that is more visible, or experience of divorce is more visible from an adult than a child perspective. And to us, this was partly surprising, because we were expecting much more a closer connection between these, for the reasons that I explained earlier. And the steepest increase we can find among the low-educated adults, and the least increase among children of highly educated parents. And also another kind of key takeaway here is this separation of the sons and the daughters' perspective in experiencing parental separation. That at the aggregate, sons and daughters are equally likely to experience parental divorce, but this is only due to the case because sons grow up in smaller families, and smaller families are less likely to experience separation. So when adjusted for family size, that it is indeed the case that sons are less likely. Sons who grow up in similar sized households or families are less likely to experience parental separation than daughters. Now, what are some implications of these findings, especially together with the original Kalman and Leopold study? That one implication is that these differences in separation risk between parents and children, and trends in these separation risks, but they're likely to be a more general pattern than what we had originally expected. That we know from a large range of countries that having children does stabilize, or couples with children are more stable than couples without children. And so that this finding that Kalman and Leopold first reported, but maybe it is more kind of a general pattern, but what we might have originally expected, at least when we started this study. Now, there was the novelty of our study was to separate the child from the son from the daughter perspective, and I think that this can be applied to other countries as well with strong son preferences. And I think that future research next to kind of looking at that, to what extent this is a general pattern, to what extent the son and daughter differences can be found in other countries, that future research can also consider that what are the family demographic pathways that create the difference in adult-child experience. So what I mean by this is that if we trace the increase in longer periods of childless cohabitation, for example, that to what extent has this contributed in many countries, maybe not China, but in many countries, to what extent has this contributed to the increase in separation rates for adults, which is then not completely translated to the experience of parental separation among children. So, thank you. Here, back to our main finding, I would say. Thank you very much.